This, remember, is not an impulsive act. The secret council sessions have pored over evidence for months. The charge, correspondence with Reginald and possession of a white tunic, interpreted as a Plantagenet rallying symbol. All it takes is suspicion. Margaret's fate is sealed by the alchemy of fear. Her arrest is the final domino in a purge that will claim scores of innocents by summer's end. As Margaret's coach clatters toward London, the city already buzzes with rumors. Fishermen on the Thames say they saw the Countess pass by, head bowed, eyes vacant. In the damp pre-dawn air, dock workers pause, shovels still, imagining her fate in the Tower's wet black cells. The execution site at Tower Hill already reeks of last week's blood. One chronicler will later write that the blackbird screamed at dawn, as if mourning the last of the Plantagenets. The air inside the Tower of London is thick, humid with centuries of whispered agony. For Margaret Pole, the first night as a prisoner is a plunge into the primal realities of Tudor justice, stone, iron, and a squalor that mocks her lineage. You stand with her now in the belly of the fortress. The cell stinks of mildew and unwashed linen. Fleas crawl in the straw, and every breath tastes faintly green, betrayed by the watery ooze running down these ancient walls. Margaret is stripped of every comfort. The Tower's warders, gruff and perfumed by sweat and cheap tobacco, confiscate her combs, her prayer book, the fine shifts that once kept her warm in Berkshire. Instead, she's issued a scratchy woolen gown mottled with years of other bodies' stains. The sound of her new chain, heavy, iron, and locked to her ankle, echoes in the cell like the tolling of a funeral bell. A chronicler named John Stowe, who would later collect tales from survivors' children, recorded that her hair, once as silver as a spring's moon, gathered lice in the heat, and her eyelids grew red from the mites. But the worst horror is the endless parade of guards, their eyes stripped of pity. They mock her age, call her traitor old woman, and make cruel guesses about how soon she'll scream for the king's mercy. Light peeks through a single arrow slit, throwing a watery shaft over the bucket in the corner, the only latrine for a woman once accustomed to golden basins. The feeder of human waste is overwhelming. Even rats shy from the darkest corners. The noises never cease. Somewhere nearby, a young man wails for his wife. Steel bites stone as axes are sharpened for the next day's beheadings. Margaret, forced to listen, her sleep broken, hears scratchings above. The Tower's crows nesting in turrets, their claws raking slate. These blackbirds, you should remember, always gather when blood follows. Outside, the whisper campaign grows feverish. Londoners crowd the taverns, tongues wagging tales of secret council hearings. One witness, Thomas Wriothesley, later a brutal interrogator himself, scribbles in his diary that we are told she doth weep and murmur dark prayers against the king. Officials circulate rumors that Margaret maintained a secret altar, or that she passed coded treason in pins and knots sewn inside her clothes. Anything to legitimize the terror resting on her aged shoulders. Visitors are forbidden, and the windows are barred. In letters later smuggled out by bribed laundresses, Margaret writes to her son Reginald, of her clean shirts gone in exchange for this rag, and no candle left to read the Psalms. The tips of her fingers bleed from anxiety. She gnaws at her nails, stripping them raw as the stress of impending doom sets in. Sometimes Margaret will scratch a prayer into the wall using a bone splinter or the iron heel of her shoe, the Latin letters trembling and pale against ancient mortar. The chamber's air grows oily with despair. Next door, another prisoner coughs up blood each morning, spattering it across the floor, and the sweet coppery stench drifts through the chinks between cells. Margaret worries she may be next. Already, a cold fever is rooting itself in her bones, her hands shaking so badly she soils herself in the night. Warders bring her only dry, hard bread and vinegar-thinned ale. No meat, no fruit, nothing fresh. A mouse dies in the wall, its carcass stinking up the cell for days before it desiccates to a greasy patch of fur and rot. If she calls for help, guards sneer, "Suffer as your son has made us suffer." All the while, Henry's council grows more ruthless, ordering informers and torturers to mine her for confessions she cannot make. Sir Richard Rich, the king's legal hatchet man, personally oversees the records, noting that she sticks to her innocence, with proud and watery eyes. Each sunrise brings the scrape of the warder's boot, the clang of the outer gate, and the promise, whispered through the Tower's labyrinth, that soon it will be Margaret's turn. But the nights are worst. Absolute dark, the stink of straw, and the certainty that somewhere above her, the headsman's axe glints in the torchlight. And yet, all this terror is merely the edge of the abyss. Her body is already paying the price, corruption setting in, promising even darker days ahead. Rot sets in before mercy arrives. Margaret Pole's noble body, eroded by weeks in that moldering cell, transforms from flesh and legacy to something raw and ailing. Visualize her, bones prominent under thinning skin, lips blistered by chronic fever, unable to keep the tower's perpetual cold from gnawing her marrow. The once pale hands that signed letters to kings now tremble as they try, futilely, to shield her face from the gnats and lice that swarm relentlessly every night. Witnesses describe the tower's lower cells as a stench pit where the living rot among the soon-to-die. Margaret is not alone in her agony. The benches outside her chamber are heavy with the dying. Nobles, monks, merchants, men and women alike, shrouded under rough woolen blankets. Coughing and retching echo down corridors crusted with saltpeter and mildew. Chronicler Richard Grafton wrote of the summer of 1539, "The tower, full of such as her grace, did stink like cesspools, and the rats grew bold, wagging tails in daylight as they gorged on leavings." The horror intensifies as her body, denied any hope of medical care, grows weak. Ulcers break open along her shins and thighs, oozing pus that seeps into her single, unwashed shift. The air in her cell thickens with the rotten sweet scent of decaying flesh, a scent so potent even the guards wince and quicken their rounds. Margaret loses weight rapidly, her cheeks caving, eyes wide and glassy. Scabs line her scalp. Her hair, shockingly white, falls in brittle clumps to the floor, carried off by scurrying mice. If you listen closely, as contemporary warder Thomas Stark wrote in a note slipped to his wife, it is as if the tower moans and breathes with disease itself, and all within are fevered, save the ravens. The food situation grows worse. When slops are passed through the hatch, Margaret finds bones floating in watered broth and weevils chewing tunnels through her bread. Parched and starved, she is sometimes too weak to lift the mug. Guards, their faces red and impassive, refuse even to clean the bucket in her corner, so its rot leaches into every thread of her clothing. When her thin mattress finally devolves to mere damp straw, sores flower along her back and thighs. They burn with every movement. Each scrape against the wall leaves flakes of skin and spots of blood. The line between prisoner and the walking dead blurs. On several occasions, as recorded by a visiting priest pressed into hearing confessions, Margaret listens as the cell beside hers goes silent. No cries, no prayers. The kind of silence that means another noble has surrendered to consumption or starvation. Every few nights she hears the shuffle of feet and soft grunt as bodies are dragged into the tunnels beneath. The sour tang of death lingers, sticky as a film over the tongue, as Margaret's only company becomes the steady drip of water from the ceiling and the screams that filter down from above. Her mind, once sharp with lineage and duty, turns inward. She mutters rosaries against the crawling itch, against the ache of dehydration, against the near-constant chills. Letters smuggled out by a sympathetic laundress speak of my hips all bone that grind on stone and the wind that bites me even in sleep. Each sunrise delivers only new humiliation, unwashed hair, open sores, and the dragging shame of her wasted frame. But nothing compares to the terror that follows. The knowledge that the tower's sick and the tower's dead are rarely natural. The cell doors clang far too often for prisoners to die of fever alone. Margaret, now a husk of her former self, wonders, will the axe come for her tonight, or will the rats? Outside, Londoners whisper about the old Countess, how she's become little more than a shadow, a breathing corpse cursed by her ancestors. Inside, she is forced to witness the daily decomposition of dignity, power, and her royal body. And just when she believes she has tasted every variety of physical suffering, the distant drum of the executioner begins to call, promising nightmares that mere disease can't deliver. Imagine watching as the world shrinks to a barred window, and through it you see death performed as spectacle, again and again. This is the horror Margaret Pole endures. For an aged woman whose veins pulse with the memory of royal courts, every dawn now brings the brutal symphony of executions echoing up from Tower Green. You witness with her the sharpened iron reality of Tudor justice. Crimson splatters, heads craned toward the block, the bone-chilling thud of blade on vertebrae. Margaret's cell is suffocating, the air sticky with sweat and sickness. But even more suffocating is the constant dread. Outside her narrow arrow slit, the scaffold is visible, a ramshackle platform hemmed by spattered straw and a sullen crowd. The guards drag prisoners past her cell, their feet scraping along stone worn smooth by 1,000 condemned souls. Some weep, others mutter prayers. The sounds cement dread so deeply in Margaret's chest she feels it, at times, crushing her remaining breath. She recognizes faces, former friends, neighbors, now traitors in the eyes of Henry's government. Each week seems to claim another, a muttering priest, a gray-haired friar, a noblewoman who once gazed down on Margaret's children at court. She hears their names spoken with venom, and then silence. Chronicler Edward Hall reports that during winter 1540, the Tower's wells steamed in mourning with blood, and the air was ever foul with the stench of death. That smell, coppery, close, mingled with the sour tang of fear, seeps into every inch of Margaret's tattered shift. Time becomes a torture. Margaret rarely sleeps. Every clang of the portcullis sends her mind darting to the block, imagining how the axe waits for her neck. Screams ricochet through the stone corridors, a young man protesting innocence, a woman begging for her children. Some days, the tower seems to pulse around her, its old stones absorbing terror and exhaling it back in drafts colder than any outside wind. The psychological torment compounds the physical. Margaret claws at the straw, shoving it into her ears to dampen the sounds, but it's useless. She learns to recognize the heavy steps of the executioner, a lumbering, plodding gait, followed by the muffled whispers of a priest. Once she makes out a chilling phrase through the noise. "Forgive those whose work is the blade." The next moment, a sickening, unmistakable sound follows. Steel splitting flesh, a sharp, wet crack, the crowd's horrified gasp. One morning, sick with fever, Margaret hears something different, a child's voice. A warder's boy, allowed in by his father to see justice, sobs openly as a nun mounts the scaffold. The boy's wail is cut short by the sound of the axe. Margaret is left shivering, sweat cold on her emaciated limbs, the odor of fresh blood rising with the dawn mist. Robert Parrott, a minor clerk, witnessed one such execution and wrote in his diary that the screams did last much longer than any ought, and the axeman's first swing fell across the shoulder, so that blood did spatter the stones most foul. Margaret cannot escape the knowledge that at the whim of her enemy she might endure infinitely worse. Every new sunrise stretches her agony. The distant Thames glimmers through her slitted window, mocking her with glimpses of normal life. But her world is now confined to rot, shrieks, and fear. She whispers prayers, but each is choked off by the knowledge that here no one is spared. Not for royal blood, not for age, not for virtue. Nights offer no relief. The death bell of St. Peter ad Vincula tolls, and the crows gather where bodies are buried under quicklime. She hears them squawking greedily at each new addition to the earth, a symphony of despair and devouring, echoing Margaret's own dread. But her own execution doesn't come. Day after day she listens, watches, waits as others are dragged screaming from the cells. The psychological torture, knowing, always knowing that her moment is coming, burrows deep, so that eventually even the rats scurrying under her cot make her flinch. She survives, barely, as spring arrives, but hope withers when she realizes what's truly ahead. A summons that will make every previous horror seem almost merciful by comparison. Death, when it comes for Margaret Pole, is not a ceremony. It is the shattering of what little dignity she has left. In spring of 1541, as sunlight claws cautiously over the slate roofs of the tower, something shifts. The guards move differently, their mutters sharper, eyes avoiding contact. There's a tension in the air thick enough to taste, like the metallic snap before thunder. Margaret, thin as a wraith, senses it instinctively. Something malignant has resolved. Then, without warning, they come for her. It's early morning. Margaret is jerked awake by booted feet and the jangle of keys, a cacophony that drowns out the coo of tower pigeons. 3 warders spill into her cell, the stench of last night's ale following them, their hands rough as rope as they grab her by the arms. She is not allowed to dress, not really. She's given a ragged shift, no head covering, not even her battered slippers. The shock of cold stone on her feet slices through her fever-fogged mind. She cries out, hoarse, unused to words, but one guard clamps a foul-smelling hand over her mouth. Her feet, swollen and ulcerated, scrape and stumble as she's dragged down the passage. She tries to protest, stammers a prayer, but the guards only tighten their grip, leaving bruises in the shape of fingers around her elbows. Thomas Stark, the warder who had pitied her before, looks away now. His knuckles turn white on the hilt of his sword, lips pinned in a thin line. Even among the hardened men of the tower, there's something unholy about this scene. Margaret has no idea what day it is. She has not seen the sun in weeks, does not know if it is a feast or a fast, only that when she emerges, the courtyard is already spattered with rain and mud. It is not the usual sight for noble executions. A crude scaffold has been thrown together in haste, rough planks slick with last night's downpour, soaked ropes left untrimmed, bloodstains from some earlier victim barely rinsed by the weather. Spectators have not gathered in their Sunday finery. Instead, a handful of guards, workmen, and servants stand awkwardly whispering with faces blanched as cheese. The progression happens too fast. Sir William Kingston, the constable of the tower, reads out the charge, or rather mumbles something about malicious intent and treasonable correspondence. There has been no trial. Margaret, shivering in her chemise, is not even permitted a priest's counsel or a final farewell. Witnesses later recall she looks dazed, wild-eyed, her lips keep moving, forming silent prayers or curses no one can say. A cold wind barrels up from the river, swirling the smells of wet wood, soiled straw, and something dark and rusty, old blood, that churns the stomachs of those assembled. One servant, John White, would write to his wife, "The stink, mistress, was such that I near sicked at my own feet," as Margaret is pushed toward the block, if it can be called a block, as it is a warped lump of wood barely higher than her knees. The onlookers avert their gaze. Many know her story, or fragments of it. They whisper of her Plantagenet blood, her lost children, the king's paranoia. They understand in that instant that England is devouring itself. She is forced to kneel, bones creaking audibly as her legs fold. Her knees smear through muck and the sticky remnant of someone else's fate. The wood presses into her chest. The smell is overpowering. A rank mixture of sweat, sour fear, and excrement. The world shrinks to this platform. The only mercy, perhaps, that her aging eyesight blurs the faces of her witnesses, erasing them into phantoms. Margaret begins to pray, fingernails digging into slick wood. She expects to be granted final words or a swift mercy, but nothing comes except the rasping shuffle of the executioner, late and unsteady. Someone in the crowd retches audibly. The wind howls. What neither Margaret nor anyone present knows, the horror is about to transcend the normal grotesqueries of Tudor execution. For the man wielding the axe is not England's chief headsman, but a terrified, unskilled apprentice, and the next moments will etch themselves into England's collective nightmares. You witness history not as legend, but as nightmare. Margaret Pole's execution is about to become one of the most horrifying spectacles ever inflicted upon a human being. Imagine for a moment you're standing on Tower Green that May morning in 1541, the sky swollen with thunderclouds, the crowd's attention fixed on a gaunt old woman kneeling in bloodied straw, her bones protruding through skin as pale as milk. Instead of an experienced headsman, the man forced to wield the axe is little more than a boy, a butcher's apprentice, limbs trembling, face slick with sweat and panic. Later accounts, including that of Ambassador Eustace Chapuys, grimly recall how the executioner was but lately made, and his hands did quake. The real headsman is missing, some say on purpose, refusing the king's demand. There is no time to fetch another. The apprentice is thrust a chipped axe, still sticky from its last victim, its edge dull and nicked. Margaret tries to calm herself, mumbling the Psalm Miserere through cracked lips. There is no mercy. The apprentice raises the axe in broad, jerky arcs. The crowd holds its breath, the only sounds the clicking of crows on the parapet and the rising wind swirling the muddy air. The first swing lands off its mark, smashing into her shoulder, splintering bone and gristle with a wet, sickening sound. Margaret screams, a raw, animal howl that ricochets off the chapel walls. Blood spurts, bright against the gray morning. The apprentice freezes, then hacks again, this time grazing her scalp and sending flecks of bone skittering onto the planks. Onlookers gag and turn away. Chronicler John Fox, in a rare moment of candor, wrote, "Her suffering was such that many wept for the cruelty, and some did cover their faces to keep from fainting. The apprentice begins to sob openly, his knees almost buckling. The axe, blunted and heavy, fails to sever clean tissue. Instead, it beats Margaret's flesh into ribbons, hacking madly at her neck, back, and skull. Blood pours in sheets, pooling under her body, soaking through the straw and planks. The air becomes choked with the coppery scent, so strong it coats the throat, metallic and nauseating. Each failed blow is a fresh agony. You can see Margaret's fingers claw at the block, the nails bending and snapping. Her white hair becomes matted with gore, her moans fading to choked gasps. Witnesses recall the sound, not the efficient thunk of a single death stroke, but the repeated, wet crunch of axe on bone, the kind of noise that burrows into a listener's nightmares. One servant collapses, vomiting into the grass. Another goes mad, clawing at his face and muttering about the martyr's agony. The crows descend, drawn by spilt blood and suffering. Their cries mingle with the muted sobs of the apprentice executioner. No one moves to help. The guards are frozen by orders. For over 10 blows, perhaps more, the hacking continues, until finally the neck is severed, the head tumbling awkwardly, still attached by ragged shreds of flesh. By the end, Margaret's body is barely recognizable. Her skin is flayed in places, her bones exposed, the platform slick with so much blood it seeps into the boots of the nearest onlookers. The chill wind carries a reek so sharp and bestial it lodges in the lungs. Some in the small crowd faint, others flee shrieking, and the young apprentice stands sobbing, splattered from head to toe in gore. Nothing in living memory has matched this. The horror is total, immediate, and unforgettable. But even as Margaret's mangled corpse is dragged away, the true purpose behind such cruelty is only just becoming clear. For when the news reaches Henry, the king's reaction chills what remains of England's humanity. The aftermath is a scene from the darkest corner of hell. Margaret's body, butchered by axe and blunder, lies face down upon the scaffold, twitching in spasms even in death, as if her murdered dignity clings on, refusing to grant Henry his final satisfaction. The plank beneath her is a sodden river of red, thick with gore and clots of torn flesh. Blood soaks every fiber of her threadbare shift. Her half-severed head lolls on tendons and splintered vertebrae, one bulging eye frozen open, lips twisted in half-spoken prayer. There is no gentle removal for this Plantagenet matriarch. Warders, soulless in their duty, seize her ankles and wrists, leaving streaks of red on their own fingers as they haul her corpse across the boards. The sound is unforgettable. The wet slide of limbs against soaked wood, the dull clacks of bone on plank, the muffled slap of meat. In the flank of her thigh, observers note, flaps of skin hang loose, proof of the executioner's wild, misplaced blows. Witnesses stand rooted in shock. The fetid wind scatters the stench of iron and offal across the green, mixing with the peasant breaths of fear and sickness. John White, the servant who earlier nearly retched, now loses control completely, doubling over and spewing his bile onto his boots. He isn't alone. Sir William Kingston himself, no novice to bloodshed, is seen pressing a kerchief to his nose, lips trembling with revulsion. "Never so foul a work have I beheld," he mutters, voice barely above the raven's caw. The spectacle brands itself into every mind present. The platform, built to raise her above the crowd, instead exposes every last detail of Margaret's ruin. The broken remnants of her neck pulse intermittently, staining the boards in jerky bursts. By the time her body is moved, puddles of blood have filled the knots in the rough planks, dripping down to the muddy earth below. A dog, maddened by the scent, snaps vainly at the gore through the scaffold's cracks until kicked aside by a rattled guard. A priest is called. Not for ceremony, but crisis. Father George Vine mutters a rushed Latin prayer, hands shaking so badly the sacramental oil dribbles onto Margaret's battered scalp and runs in tangled rivulets through her mangled hair. He makes the sign of the cross but cannot meet her ruined gaze. The wind gusts, flattening her hair to the block, scattering blood across his shoes. Overhead the crows wheel closer, emboldened now that death has come and gone. There is no dignity in the disposal. Margaret is unceremoniously thrown onto a bier. Her head almost falls from her shoulders as the body is jostled down the scaffold's slick steps. Unwashed, unwrapped, denied the final clean white shroud reserved for noble dead, her remains are bundled in coarse cloth still wet with blood and carted toward St. Peter ad Vincula. The pathway reeks, every step releasing waves of coagulated death. The iron tang carried up the nostrils of all who must follow. Along the short procession, onlookers clear away, faces pinched with disgust or pale with silent rage. In life, Margaret Pole embodied the royalty of England's past. But now, in death, she is stripped of every last symbol, power, pride, even a proper burial. The open grave at the chapel's north wall is shallow and hastily dug. No rites are waited for. Her mangled remains are dumped in, gravel and lime falling in clumps, half muffling the grisly evidence of her torment. By the day's end, the rain returns, and the green is cleaned. Guards swill buckets of water across the gore-stained boards, but the stains refuse to fade. The stench lingers, sweet and coppery, a warning to all who pass that royal blood offers no shield. But as dreadful as this reality is, the next revelation will burn even deeper. The cold, delighted reaction of the man who ordered it all. If you thought horror ended with the corpse, witness how cruelty breeds in the monarch's grinning gaze. The news of Margaret Pole's butchery doesn't drift back to Henry VIII. It sprints, borne on the scandalized lips of courtiers and shaken tower men. You see the scene, a thick London fog curling around Whitehall, jostling elbows and anxious faces in the court's antechambers. The stench of the Tower, blood and rot, lingers only in the stories, but fear ripples outward, a silent, invisible reek settling into the bones of every noble who hears about the carnage. The king receives the tidings not with shame, but a chilling, satisfied smile. Ambassador Eustace Chapuys reports that when the details of Margaret's agony were relayed, each wild swing of the axe, each shriek from the crowd, Henry laughed. Actually laughed. Courtiers, dumbstruck, avoid his gaze. Others, desperate for approval, force twisted grins or glance at the floor. No one dares object. The entire room knots in silent dread, aware they're now ruled by a man who finds sadistic pleasure not just in victory, but in annihilation. All pretense of nobility or tradition is burned away. Here is the monster unmasked. The king is more than political brute or tyrant. He's joined the executioners and the rats, feasting on violence for his own entertainment. Chapuys' letter to Charles V describes it coldly. His Majesty, having heard how the victim was dispatched, waxed in good humor the rest of the feast, and swore none with Plantagenet blood would ever trouble his throne again. Margaret's living relatives, her grandchildren, her far-flung kin, recognized the message at once. A chill settles over every name tied, however distantly, to York or Plantagenet claim. They begin burning old letters, destroying family crests, erasing every mark of their ancestry that might catch the king's eye. The execution is no longer just a punishment. It's a contagion, sparking terror in noble houses from Kent to York. Even distant country squires whisper at night, terrified that a careless word could make them next. The physical reality of Margaret's death lingers, twisted in the city's air. The Tower's guards struggle to sleep, haunted by memories of her mutilated frame. More than one turns to drink, shuddering at even the clatter of knives in the Tower kitchens. Some admit years later to hearing her voice in the wind that whistles down the White Tower's corridors, an old woman still begging for justice no king would ever grant her. The city absorbs the lesson. Vendors gossip in grim undertones, their voices dropping when men in velvet cloaks pass by. Mothers hush unruly children with warnings. Stay silent, lest the king hear, invoking Margaret's fate alongside old tales of the Black Death and bogeymen. Even the beggars at the Tower's foot sense the new order, one where not even royal blood can buy mercy, where dignity and body alike are meat for the axe. It is said the Chapel Royal's flag never rose above half-staff for Margaret Pole. Her grave, unmarked and trampled, weeds choking the lime-soaked soil, says everything about the world Henry's smile has made. If England was ever a realm of chivalry or redemption, it died in that moment with her, destroyed not just by steel, but by the glee of its sovereign, and so terror becomes policy. Anyone, related to ancient nobility, to past rulers, now lives in the long shadow of the Tower, nervously measuring every breath. Margaret Pole's agony is no isolated story. It is a warning burnt into the flesh of a kingdom. But if you think this was the final cruelty, remember Margaret's last plea. A whisper barely heard above the crowd's sobs. begging God's mercy, because her king had none left to give. Stand in the footprints of that scaffold, among the ghosts and gore, the blood soaking through warped boards, the wind churning the stench of fear and iron. Margaret Pole's death wasn't just a historical footnote, it was a deliberate spectacle, a message hammered into flesh and memory by a king who needed his enemies to suffer even beyond the grave. The horror of her execution, the shivering fever, the flayed dignity, the jaw-splitting blows, turned a wary court into a realm of silence and obedience. Each detail, from the first clack of iron cuffs to Henry VIII's twisted delight, drew a hard, bloody line across England's history. Her corpse was ruined, her memory warped, but the bruises she left on the soul of the kingdom ache centuries later. If you ever wonder how tyranny thrives, remember what one execution can do, not just ending a life, but mutilating the entire body politic. Some wounds go on bleeding, long after the axe falls.